Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's get Series 6 of today's Tolkien Times underway with Week 42's Mailbag Monday. Now, first, we have a few things to talk through. Though this is a daily show, you're not going to be shocked to learn that I don't record it and publish it first thing every single morning. That's just not possible. Like the PPP, I record these in advance in order to make sure that we have time to edit them and schedule releases across all the platforms. That's why in Week 41, at the end of last series, you didn't hear me say anything about the passing of Bernard Hill, the actor who played King Théoden in the Lord of the Rings movies. Those episodes were recorded before he passed away. Now, by the time you see or listen to this episode, 2 weeks will have gone by since his death on May 5th. But I still don't want it to go unmarked here on my show. And so, while I will be finishing a long-expected party on this series' Third Age Thursdays, those readings will take only the first 5 weeks. So, in the last 3 weeks of this series on Third Age Thursdays, I'll honor Bernard Hill and his portrayal of Théoden by reading some of my favorite passages about the King of Rohan from the Lord of the Rings. Now, on another note, on last Wednesday, May 15th, while the show was on its usual 2-week hiatus between series, the TTT celebrated its 1-year anniversary. Thank you for watching or listening or even both all this time. And this Thursday will mark the 250th episode of the TTT as well. Also, during the break, we heard news about the new film coming out in 2026. Peter Jackson, Fran Walsh, and Philippa Boyens producing The Hunt for Gollum, with Andy Serkis reprising his role and featuring as director. Now, as I learn more, we'll talk about that. And in fact, we may have a live stream coming up sometime in the next little bit in order to just talk this through and kind of chat about all the things that are happening in the world of adaptations. Because, of course, Rings of Power Season 2 is launching in the fall sometime. And then, of course, we have War of the Rohirrim in December, which is why I did Cirion and Eorl back in Series 4. Now, on to today's mailbag. Veronway of Gondolin, okay, sure, if you say so, wrote in with an interesting question that James Tauber and I actually talked about on the PPP on episode 330, which actually just released yesterday, if you're listening to both of them on the day that they come out. But since not all of you listen to both shows, or some that do are still a few seasons behind the current PPP episodes, I thought I'd discuss it here as well. Now, Veronway starts by quoting Gandalf in the chapter Homeward Bound. "I'm going to have a long talk with Bombadil, such a talk as I have not had in all my time. He is a moss-gatherer, and I have been a stone doomed to rolling. But my rolling days are ending, and now we shall have much to say to one another." And later, Gandalf answering Frodo that Tom is likely quite untroubled, and I should guess not much interested in anything that we have done or seen, unless perhaps in our visits to the Ents. He then asks, what do you think Gandalf and Tom Bombadil talked about? Great question. He says maybe Gandalf would thank him for helping Frodo and company with Old Man Willow and the Barrow-wight, perhaps the Ents, as mentioned. Or could Tom possibly know where the Entwives went? Good questions, Veronway. Now, as I observed in the PPP episode, Tom Bombadil and Gandalf are both truly ancient beings. Gandalf, as the Maya Olorin, came into existence with the very thought of Iluvatar before the beginning of time. Tom Bombadil, and that's a subject for another day, is as old as Arda itself, it would seem. But whatever Tom's role was earlier in the history of Arda, he has since withdrawn from the world at large and has hunkered down in his little kingdom here. Now, as Gandalf put it at the council, "And now he is withdrawn into a little land, within bounds that he has set, though none can see them, waiting perhaps for a change of days, and he will not step beyond them." And indeed, Tom confirmed that to the hobbits when he bade them farewell as he left them on the edge of the road to Bree. They begged him to come at least as far as the inn and drink once more with them, but he laughed and refused, saying, "Tom's country ends here. He will not pass the borders. Tom has his house to mind, and Goldberry is waiting." So that's Tom. Ancient, but locked in one place for a very long time, a voluntary moss-gatherer. Gandalf, on the other hand, has been wandering the north of Middle-earth in his incarnate form for more than 2,000 years. After all, Mithrandir means the Grey Pilgrim, the Grey Wanderer. So the two of them do have a lot to talk about indeed, in whatever meter Tom would be using that month. Now, as to what they would talk about, James made a great observation in our conversation on the PPP that I think would be my starting point here, and that is that while there may be a lot for Gandalf to say, there may not be a lot that Tom would actually care about. That is, Tom is going to have very few, if any, questions for Gandalf. "Hey, doll, Mary doll, what'd you do to the Balrog?" isn't on the list of his interests. I mean, remember, he's very limited in terms of what matters to him. Now, that said, I think Gandalf gives us one clue about something that might interest Tom, and that's the encounter with Treebeard and the Ents. Now, remember, Tom is in some ways a personification of nature. In letter number 19 to Stanley Unwin, all the way back in 1937, Tolkien describes Tom as the spirit of the vanishing Oxford and Berkshire countryside. Of course, he's far more than that, and also far less defined. Letter number 144 to Naomi Mitchison reminds us that Bombadil is an intentional enigma, but he's also not an important person to the narrative, according to that very same letter. Anyway, all that to say that Tom would be interested in hearing about Treebeard and what happened with the Ents. After all, it is highly likely, given their respective statuses as eldest, that both Tom and Treebeard have encountered one another at some time long in the past. Remember that we learned from Elrond to the Council that of the old forest many tales have been told. All that now remains is but an outlier of its northern march. Time was when a squirrel could go from tree to tree, from what is now the Shire to Dunland, west of Isengard. More than that, Treebeard himself explained to Merry and Pippin that there was all one wood once upon a time from here to the mountains of Loon, and this was just the east end. Given that, it seems very likely to me, if not virtually certain, that Tom and Treebeard not only know of each other, but have actually met at some point in history. So of course Tom would be interested in that part of the story, and given his status as a nature spirit of some kind, the defeat of Saruman by the Ents. Now, as for the Entwives of Aranway, I'm afraid Tolkien has thoughts on that as well, also in letter number 144, which we've looked at twice already. He has no connection in my mind with the Entwives. What had happened to them is not resolved in this book. He, meaning Tom, is in a way the answer to them in the sense that he is almost the opposite, being, say, botany and zoology as sciences, and poetry, as opposed to cattle breeding and agriculture and practicality. I think that, in fact, the Entwives had disappeared for good, being destroyed with their gardens in the War of the Last Alliance, when Sauron pursued a scorched earth policy and burned their land against the advance of the allies down the Anduin. So Tom wouldn't know what happened to them, as their end took place far from his now small, well-defined kingdom. But the rest of the story, Aragorn's ascension to the throne, Rohan, the hobbits, the defeat of the Witch King, or even the destruction of the ring, wouldn't interest Tom as much, and so I think it would be more a matter of the questions that Gandalf would pose to him. Now, having said that, I think he might care a bit about the defeat of the Witch King, since he was obviously connected to the realms of Arnor in their day, as we can see from the gifts that he gave to the hobbits after the incident at the Barrows. And I imagine Gandalf would ask some deep questions, questions that only Tom would have the answer to. And this gets into the question of what Gandalf knows or remembers from his time in Valinor. So it's getting well beyond the scope of today's question. But I think it is safe to say that in his incarnate form as Gandalf, he's like any other human. He wants answers to mysteries. And Tom would have a lot of ancient knowledge. Although I rather suspect that most of it would be only vaguely remembered unless it specifically impacted Tom. Now, if you do listen to the PPP, be sure to check out episode 330. And then, better yet, if you're a patron of the PPP, check out the P5, that's the Prancing Pony Podcast Patreon postscript, for episodes 329 and 330, as James and I talk about this for a good 10 minutes or more just on that one topic. For now, though, folks, that wraps it up for Mailbag Monday. Now, if you have a question that you'd like me to answer, please email it to barnaman@theprancingponypodcast.com. Let him know it's for today's Tolkien Times, and I'll get to it just as soon as possible, with priority going to supporters of the show on Patreon. Now, if you'd like to help me keep making this show better, please visit patreon.com/TolkienTimes to find out how you can join the TTT Content Council, get a bonus episode every week, and more. And then join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Tolkien Tuesday as we learn more about the professor himself. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Follow or subscribe in your podcast apps and follow @Tolkien Times on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.